Okay, welcome everybody to our Palestine and Her Road to Freedom webinar. I am Fatima Wise and I'm the trustee of the Essa Moosa Education Foundation and also chairman of Sharing Hope Foundation. So I will just be giving you a brief overview of who my grandfather was and why we are actually having this webinar this morning on Mandela Day. So my grandfather was late Judge Essa Moosa, who stood at the center of law during the embattled years of apartheid that many South Africans couldn't understand. And in post-apartheid, he served as the secretary of the Constitutional Committee of the acclaimed South African Constitution. He never conceded to a law that was unjust, and he challenged every apartheid violation that he could during his time. He was a pioneer for human rights and he became known as the struggle lawyer or fondly as the people's lawyer. He was a universal human rights advocate and he stood vehemently against the Israeli oppression of Palestinians due to the occupation. And the fact that people have been forcibly removed from their homes, and with my grandpa's own experience of being forcibly removed from District 6, it gave him no option but to be against all forms of oppression. In his last days, he was visited by Chief Nelson Mandela, Minister Naledi Pandor, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, among others. And this spoke of the impact that he made on the people around him. And only 48 hours before his passing, and I remember this very clearly, I was in the room at the time and it will remain with me forever. He implored his family to always stand up for the poor and impoverished. And this speaks volumes to who he was as a person and the life that he led in servitude of the people until his dying breath. And something he always mentioned, and I remember him saying, education before liberation. And it is with that we started the Education Foundation. And with this in mind, we as an organization found it important to keep the conversations about Palestine alive. When we heard also about the Hamas having adopted the Nelson Mandela ethos, we thought it important and imperative to bring a voice to this ideology and to assist in further reach and understanding among our people. So we cannot stop the conversations about Palestine. We need to keep it going so that we ensure pressures on the international community remain open to effecting the change that we need desperately for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. On our panel this morning, we have Dr. Reverend Alan Boesak, who is an anti-apartheid activist, and he will be speaking about the importance of unity for purpose in the context of the formation of the UDF in South Africa and Palestinian unity toward a lasting solution. We will have Khalid Mash'al, chairman of Hamas Politburo Abroad, who will be expanding on the adoption of the Nelson Mandela ethos and what that means practically towards liberation. We will also have Thembisa Fakude, who he is the Senior Research Fellow of Africa-Asia Dialogues, and he will be speaking about the media shift in the coverage of the Palestinian struggle, the liberation of the media, and the advent of social media. Zeenat Adam, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Africa-Middle East Center, and she will be expanding on a focus on the women behind the legendary Nelson Mandela and discuss the parallels drawn with Palestinian women and their struggle. And then we will have Mr. Naeem Jeenah, who is the Executive Director of Afro-Middle East Center, who will be acting as our webinar respondent. After all the speakers, we will have a short Q&A session. And I'm going to now introduce you to our moderator, Khalid Sayed, who we've known for a very long time and who has an extensive accolade in his political career, which you can go read on the bios on our pages. But I just want to say that we've worked a lot with him, and I firmly believe that he is one of the youngest members of the provincial legislature, and I firmly believe that he is one of those comrades who will definitely be able to make a difference in our communities, in our country. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Khalid.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much, Fatima, for the kind words and for, I think, really summing up the gist of this particular program and the importance of the webinar, which I think, just as an intro, it's very appropriate that this particular webinar, particularly, I think, a focus, yes, around Palestine's path to liberation, but also a discussion around the methodology and approach of Hamas, who have really risen to prominence in the recent period. I mean, us in South Africa, given the African National Congress background with many and the populism of the PLO, would understand that history. But I think for many of us, it's an interesting period now for us to also learn more about what Hamas stands for as well. So it's very important. Its rise to prominence in the resistance against Israeli apartheid, as well as its rise to prominence as a political formation as well in the body politic of the Palestinian people and in Gaza in particular. A very, very important discussion. And it's important that this discussion takes place on a day like today, when we as South Africans are celebrating the birthday of one of our founding fathers, Comrade President Nelson Mandela, somebody who said that South Africa is not free until Palestine is free, who dedicated his life to struggle and was deeply passionate about the Palestinian struggle, but also very passionate about about exploring different ways and means in pursuit of the people's struggle, engagements and building unity, because I think part of this discussion is also to build unity within the ranks of those who are striving for the liberation of Palestine, including here in South Africa as well. I think that's also important to understand that there are different approaches, but that we have got one vision. And let me also re-emphasize and just thank you and thank the family, and also to say that we continue to remain dedicated to the legacy of your late grandfather, the late judge. We've had the honor of also spending some time with him, interacting with him, and the role that he's played in our lives, even as young activists, will continue to be appreciated. So we thank you, and we thank the family for that. I think without any further ado, Fatima has given the intro. Let me introduce our first speaker. We've spoken about the Hamas context, and our first speaker is a leader that stands out in the global body politic, who stands out in the global resistance against imperialist arrogance. None other than a dear brother and friend of the South African liberation, Khalid Mishal. Khalid Mishal is currently the chairman of the Hamas Politburo Board. Is the chairman of the Hamas Politburo abroad. Sorry, I missed my R there. After the founding of Hamas in 1987, Khalid Mishal actually became the leader of the Kuwaiti branch of the organization. So he's outside of Palestine. In 1992, he became a founding member of Hamas's Politburo, and he also became the chairman. It was under his leadership, in fact, that Hamas did very well in the Palestinian elections in 2006, and won a majority of seats in the Palestinian legislative election. He then stepped down as Hamas's chair of the Politburo in 2017, but continues to play a very prominent role. Just on a personal note, it was also an honor and pleasure we have been able to, first time I met with Khalid Mishal was in Damascus, I think in 2009, at a function hosted by the South African Embassy. The late, I mean, not the late, the former ambassador Muhammad Dango was the host. So Khalid Mishal has always been a friend of South Africa. We also welcomed him to South Africa in 2015 with the Hamas delegation. So we look forward to listening to him, and we welcome you to our platform. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. We'll now listen to our dear brother Khalid Mishal. Fatima, is the connection there, or we see him online?
He is online.
We still see him online.
And then Sheikh Shuaib will be translating.
Yes, okay. If we can maybe just...
let me just ask to unmute.
He's set to speak for 20 minutes.
Yes. Let me also just see what I can do on my side here.
In the meantime, Fatima, should we not have the first, I mean, should we not go to the next speaker, or do you want to?
I think, yes, let's go to the next speaker. I'm trying to get hold of them.
Time.
Yes, I'm trying to get hold of them, and as soon as I do, I will let you know.
In the interest of time. So I won't, when he comes up, we will just obviously ask him to speak.
So,
we won't do the introduction. So the next speaker, and we will actually then kick off. It's also possibly appropriate in that we set the discussion within a South African context, is a stalwart of the liberation struggle in South Africa, somebody who showed that the role of religion, and interesting also because Hamas starts off as, or Hamas is an Islamic movement, also showed that in South Africa, the important role that religion and that the church plays in liberation and in social justice. None other than Dr. Reverend Alan Boesak, a renowned academic, a renowned activist, somebody who's also been involved very much even in the post-democratic South African political landscape, a human rights activist, but who's also been very passionate and dedicated to the struggle for a free Palestine. Dr. Boesak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Khalid and Fatima. My great thanks to the Essa and Fatima Moosa Foundation for this great privilege to be with this distinguished panel this morning to speak about this subject. And my hope is that our brother Khalid from Hamas will join us very soon. I am still thinking with great fondness and some sense of longing to the times when Essa and I worked together over 30 years. We worked together in the struggle. He became also my personal lawyer, but the family also became our family's friends. So that friendship means a lot to me still today, and I'm so grateful to be here. Let me say a few things about the subject of unity and the importance of it within the context of the United Democratic Front. Now, Palestine and South Africa are both settler colonialist projects. Although there is one important difference, the South African colonialist project could not completely physically eliminate and displace the indigenous population, although they tried. So when it failed, they decided rather to conquer, control, and exploit through systemic, structural, and institutional racist oppression and violence at every single level and in every area of life. In Palestine, though, it seems to me, the colonialist settler project does want to do that. It goes further. There are clear plans, it seems to me, clear plans and strategies to completely eliminate and displace the Palestinian population, both physically and politically. And we can see those plans coming to fruition in what is still happening today from the time of the Nakba onwards to now. But one thing, with all of the differences that remains the same, is for the oppressor to sow and to maintain by any means necessary the disunity and division amongst the oppressed population. And that has always been their most desperate need. In South Africa, an essential part of that strategy of division and disunity was the racialization of the oppressed population themselves. Racial categorization in every area of life with differentiated levels of so-called privilege and access to what South Africa had to offer. Now, we understood the impact of that strategy. And so in a way, our struggle from the very beginning was not just against colonialism and against apartheid, but for the unity of the oppressed people. And these efforts became significant in the late 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, through the Black consciousness movement, a philosophy that sought to reclaim our human dignity and worth in this country in the face of a most vicious form of white supremacy and racism, and called for unity and solidarity amongst the oppressed. It was a very powerful movement, and it changed the hearts and minds and strategies and actions and lives of a whole generation. But it seems to me that the real moment of change came when all of these efforts from the past came together with the formation of the United Democratic Front in 1983. It came at a crucial point when the apartheid regime began to feel real pressure internally, especially, but also externally, when they implemented some superficial forms of reform in order to avoid scrapping apartheid altogether. For South Africans, though, that meant that they have promised a constitution which would give some limited form of participation to so-called coloreds and Indians, but excluding the vast majority of our people. The United Democratic Front had a very simple slogan: apartheid divides, UDF unites. But these four words represented an unprecedented phenomenon and power in our history. It brought together activists, not in their individual capacity, but activists as part of activist organizations from across the country, urban areas and rural areas, from everywhere, across generations, across the barriers of class and race and culture and religion. It was something new in its power, in its dynamism, in its freshness, and in its enthusiasm. It brought together all of us for one purpose, namely to thoroughly and finally and fundamentally defeat apartheid and all its systems. It challenged the apartheid regime at every level, politically, economically, socially, culturally, and religiously. It recognized and it encouraged and it nurtured leadership in local communities. And so it was a very decentralized organization in that sense. It made also room for youth, not only to participate in the struggle meaningfully, but to give that same meaningful leadership in the struggle. And so young people were at the forefront and at the center and permeated the whole movement at every level. It allowed local communities to take their own initiatives and to make sure that these local initiatives strengthened the national struggle. Because the unity in the United Democratic Front was so strong and it was so focused, it also helped our allies in the international community to unite and to focus as well in the issues where they could be most helpful. I'm thinking of these issues to raise awareness and consciousness of our situation in their own countries, to put concentrated pressure on their own governments, and to concentrate on the actions that were most effective as they were guided by us, namely boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. So actions abroad and actions in South Africa coincided, but the leadership was given clearly from the people of South Africa. The United Democratic Front started its work in 1983. By 1985, we saw the first state of emergency. By 1987, we saw the second state of emergency. The repressive reaction from the regimes were vicious and consistent and unending. But by 1989, we could see the apartheid walls were crumbling. And in February 1990, Nelson Mandela stepped out of prison, a free leader of our people, to become the first president of a democratic South Africa. Now, it is true, of course, that the United Democratic Front was not the only actor involved in these events. But it is my conviction, and I think that history will bear this out, that were it not for the United Democratic Front and its concerted actions over more than a decade, its steadfast, united actions, that the regime would have lasted much longer. Our struggle would have been much more retarded in terms of time and in terms of achievements, and our people would not have been where we came to be in April of 1994. So unity in the ranks of the oppressed people that tackled every single purpose and strategy from the side of the regime at every level, leaving no single area to chance or unchallenged. That sort of brought everything together in that wedge that we could drive into the apartheid wall and finally made it crumble. And it seems to me that that remains a key instrument of struggle, whether it is in South Africa or whether it is in Palestine. But as far as Palestine is concerned, the concerted, concentrated focus and solidarity of South Africans I see is growing and will not abate. And what gives me great joy is that the recent actions of Palestine and of the Palestinian youth in the last few months that we have seen has awakened the conscience of the world like nothing else has ever before. And I see across the world people now standing up for Palestine. And I know I lived for 6 years in the United States and how they really suppressed any kind of effort to show any kind of solidarity with justice for Palestinians, and how those efforts are now running into the brick wall of solidarity that is growing even in the United States, in the Britain, and in Europe. And for that, I want to congratulate the Palestinians, but I also want to say this may be now the moment that a breakthrough may come that we have not seen in this level before, and I pray and wish that it happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our esteemed stalwart of South Africa's liberation, Dr. Alan Boesak, really for speaking very much to the issue of unity. I'm sure we'll be speaking much to that later on. I just want to, I've also seen in the webinar, just to also welcome, I see we've got a Member of Parliament, the Honorable Hanif Hendricks of the Al Jama'ah Party. We wish to welcome you. Also a leader in the community and proponent of the Palestinian struggle. We also see our ambassador, South Africa's ambassador to we also see South Africa's ambassador to Qatar, Mr. Faisal Moosa. We welcome you, Your Excellency, to this particular webinar. Now, the first speaker that we were supposed to have was our dear brother and leader of Hamas, Khalid Mish'al, the head of the Hamas Politburo abroad. We gave the introduction, and we are now going to call upon our dear brother to address us, a dear friend of South Africa, somebody who is respected by the South African people, and somebody whom we know also has a deep love for South Africa, for our liberation, and for our people. He's somebody who has visited South Africa and who has even interacted with the South African leadership, whether in Damascus or whether in Doha. At the moment, we welcome you to the platform. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Walyatafaddal mashkoor.
It seems the speaker is muted. We can't hear anything.
Okay.
Oh, he's not muted, so I'm not sure why we aren't hearing anything.
We see him.
Excuse me, did you start the translation?
Shu'aib?
No, I didn't hear a thing.
Okay, I think we can start now.
Okay. أقول بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تحية لكم في جنوب إفريقيا الدولة الصديقة وشعبها الصديق الشجاع، ونتمنى لكم المزيد من التقدم والازدهار، وأن تتجاوزوا ما تعانون منه هذه الأيام من الكورونا ومن المشكلات التي لا تكاد دولة في العالم تخلو منها. نتمنى لكم كل خير، فأنتم بالنسبة لنا مثل مهم ومحترم.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Brother Khalid Mish'al comments with his warm greetings to the people of South Africa, and he hoped for them that they will continue in advancing in their struggle and overcome the trials and difficulties that they're experiencing, be it Corona or be it the other political challenges which no country in the world experiences. So every country somehow or the other experiences these kinds of challenges and upheavals and trials. So he hopes and prays that we overcome all of these.
شكرا لكم على استضافتي في هذه الندوة المهمة في يوم نيلسون مانديلا، هذا الرجل العظيم، لنستحضر ونستدعي القيم والمبادئ التي آمن بها مانديلا وعمل بها لصالح شعبه حتى تحرر من نظام الفصل العنصري.
Okay, he's grateful for having offering him this wonderful opportunity and hosting him, especially on this special day, the day of honoring and remembering the former president Nelson Mandela, and also to recall and remember the values and the ideals that he stood for.
وشكرا للجهات التي نظمت هذه الندوة وللمتحدثين الكرام الذين يشاركوننا فيها.
And also thank you to all those organizers and all those presenters and speakers in today's seminar or webinar.
في البداية أود التأكيد أن المبادئ التي آمن بها نيلسون مانديلا هي المبادئ الإنسانية في أعلى قيمها وتجلياتها.
Right at the beginning, he wishes to emphasize and acknowledge that the very values that President Nelson Mandela stood for are the very values, human values and Islamic values and human values.
والمبادئ الإسلامية والمبادئ الأديان والمبادئ الإنسانية كلها تدعو إلى هذه القيم، لأن هذه الفطرة الإنسانية التي فطرها الله تعالى على الحرية.
And these values which were acknowledged and respected by all religions and by humanity at large. And amongst these are one of the foremost of these values is freedom.
ولذلك قال سيدنا عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه أحد الخلفاء الراشدين وأصحاب النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم: متى استعبدتم الناس وقد ولدتهم أمهاتهم أحرارا.
And in this regard, one of the great Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, made a famous statement, and he said, "Since when have you enslaved people and their mothers have given birth to them as free and emancipated people?"
آمن مانديلا بالسلام. نعم، فالسلام قيمة إنسانية ودينية عظيمة، والسلام عندنا كمسلمين هو أحد أسماء الله الحسنى.
Nelson Mandela believed in peace, and peace is a global and an international right and a value. And for us as Muslims, it is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So peace and salam is one of the foremost values for us as Muslims.
ولكن السلام كما آمن به مانديلا وكما يؤمن به شعبنا الفلسطيني وأحرار العالم، ليس السلام في ظل الاحتلال.
And the peace that Nelson Mandela spoke about, as well as that which the peace that the Palestinians speak about, and all free and liberated people of the world spoke about, is not the one that is under the banner of occupation.
لا معنى للسلام في ظل بقاء الاحتلال والاستيطان.
There is no meaning towards peace or for peace under the banner, under the umbrella of occupation.
لا سلام في ظل نظام الفصل العنصري.
There is no peace under an apartheid regime or an apartheid system.
لا سلام في ظل العدوان والقتل والحصار والتهجير.
There is no peace under occupation and forced evictions and killing and onslaughts, violent attacks, etc.
لا سلام في ظل عمليات الطرد والتهجير والتطهير العرقي الذي يمارسه المستعمرون والمحتلون.
There is no peace with forced evictions, with banishment and land occupation, etc.
السلام الحقيقي يتحقق في ظل التخلص من الاحتلال والاستعمار والاستيطان.
True peace will be achieved through freeing ourselves from colonization and occupation and from the settlements.
السلام الحقيقي يتحقق حين تحصل الشعوب على الحرية والعدالة.
True peace will be achieved as long as the nation or the people achieve justice and freedom.
وحق تقرير المصير.
And lay forward the road going ahead.
وتحقيق الاستقلال.
And true realization of freedom and independence.
من أكبر الأخطاء حين تبادر بعض الدول الكبرى لتطالب الشعب الفلسطيني أو أي شعب في العالم يتعرض للاحتلال أن ينشد أنشودة السلام بينما هو يعيش تحت الاحتلال والعدوان ولا يتمتع بالحرية ولا بالاستقلال.
One of the greatest mistakes many countries or many people make when they speak about the Palestinians, or when it comes to asking them to give up their particular their struggle.
ولأن الاستقلال والحرية والعدالة والتخلص من الاحتلال لا يتحقق إلا بالمقاومة بكل أشكالها، ومنها المقاومة المسلحة آمن بها مانديلا ورفقاؤه في ANC، وبسببها وعلى طريقها انتصروا وحققوا أهدافهم في الحرية.
And one of the ways of achieving this kind of independence and freedom is through muqawama, which is resistance in all of its forms. And one of its forms is required at times is an armed resistance. And this is something which even Nelson Mandela had acknowledged and believed in. And he and his fellow members and comrades within the ANC had accepted this form of resistance.
المقاومة حق للشعوب التي تعاني من الاحتلال، حق كفلته الشرائع الدولية والشرائع السماوية.
And this kind of resistance is a right for every oppressed or suppressed nation, and this has been acknowledged by the international law.
ولأن المقاومة حق لهذه الشعوب، فإن نيلسون مانديلا العظيم رفض المساومة عليها ورفض الإعلان عن نبذها تحت أي شرط من الشروط.
And because this kind of resistance is a right, therefore we find that even Nelson Mandela refused to negotiate and to compromise on some of these principles.
أصلاً ما في شعب في التاريخ تحرر بدون نضال ومقاومة.
And likewise, throughout history, we find that there is no nation that achieved this kind of independence or freedom without resistance.
لأن القوى الاستعمارية في كل مكان في العالم وعبر التاريخ لا يحكمها ولا يضبطها لا القيم ولا المبادئ، وإنما يتم ردعها عبر المقاومة، فتفرض على هذه القوى الاستعمارية أثمانا بهذه المقاومة فيدفعها للتراجع وإعطاء الشعوب حريتها واستقلالها.
And because colonialists or suppressors or oppressors, whoever they may be, generally don't live up to any particular moral code or ethics, therefore the only way that they can be dealt with is through resistance. And this way they will be forced to give up, and therefore these nations will achieve some of their freedom and their dignity.
هناك كما تعلمون منذ سنوات طويلة هناك قوة دولية تضغط على الشعب الفلسطيني حتى يتخلى عن المقاومة وينبذها بحجة أن من أجل أن نحقق السلام. فمتى تحقق السلام في أي بقعة في الأرض بدون نضال شعوب تلك البلاد؟
He said, as you all are well aware, that a few years now that there's international pressure on the Palestinians to give up their resistance in order to achieve peace. And since when have we seen that when any nation gives up a resistance, they would actually achieve any kind of peace?
ياسر عرفات القائد الفلسطيني الكبير كما تعلمون وصديق نيلسون مانديلا صنع اتفاقية سلام في التسعينيات من القرن الماضي مع إسرائيل. ماذا كانت النتيجة؟ لم يتحقق السلام، وفي نهاية الأمر إسرائيل قتلت ياسر عرفات بالسم.
We all know of Yasser Arafat, who was a close friend of Nelson Mandela. He signed the peace agreement in the 90s with Israel. But what was the result? The result was there was no peace. In fact, Israel poisoned him and had him killed.
وكذلك الرئيس محمود عباس واصل طريق الاتفاقيات وأوسلو، والنتيجة أيضا لم يتحقق السلام، بل زاد الاستيطان وزاد القتل والعدوان والحروب الإسرائيلية على شعبنا. وأيضا العالم اليوم لا يتعامل بجدية مع القيادة الفلسطينية، لأنه لا يتعامل إلا مع من يمسكون بقوة بورقة المقاومة ويشكلون ضغطا حقيقيا على الاحتلال.
Likewise, we find that Mahmoud Abbas continued in the same manner, maintaining those agreements, the Oslo Agreement, etc. But despite all of that, the settlements continued, the war continued, the killing continued, and therefore the rest of the world was not serious with the Palestinian leadership when in their claim or in their call for peace.
نعم، العالم يحترم من يدعو إلى السلام، ولكن حين يكون قويا. أما من يدعو إلى السلام وهو لا يملك أوراق القوة الكافية فإنه لا أحد يحتفل به.
Yes, the world respects the call to peace, but there is no real honor to it when the person who calling towards it is not, or the people being called to are not holding the authority to it.
أيضا من مبادئ مانديلا رفض التعاون مع المحتل ومع نظام الفصل العنصري بأي شكل من أشكال التعاون.
Also, we find that Nelson Mandela, one of his principles was that he refused to cooperate or to negotiate or to surrender surrender to the oppressors and those who were unjust.
لا تعاون مع المحتلين.
There's no cooperation with occupiers.
ولذلك نحن في فلسطين نرفض كل أشكال التعاون والتنسيق الأمني مع المحتل الإسرائيلي.
Therefore, we in Palestine refuse to cooperate with all the occupiers and the Israeli regime.
وندعو باستمرار السلطة الفلسطينية في رام الله إلى التخلي عن سياسة التنسيق الأمني التي تخدم المحتل الإسرائيلي وتضر بأمن ومصالح الشعب الفلسطيني.
And therefore we call upon the authorities in Ramallah and the areas to give up this peace kind of agreement with the Israelis.
من مبادئ مانديلا وتصريحاته العظيمة أنه أدان إسرائيل وأسماها كيانا عنصريا ودولة إرهابية لأنها ارتكبت المذابح ضد الشعب الفلسطيني.
And amongst the principles of Mandela is that he regarded the practices of Israel as apartheid and unjust and oppressive system.
واعتبر العنصرية آفة على الضمير الإنساني.
And he regarded this apartheid as an enemy to the humanity.
وكما تعلمون نيلسون مانديلا وقف مع نضال الشعب الفلسطيني وزار غزة والتقى بالرئيس ياسر عرفات.
And like you all aware that Nelson Mandela stood with the Palestinian people. He visited Gaza and he visited Yasser Arafat.
وكما وقف الشعب الفلسطيني والمناضلون الفلسطينيون مع نضال الشعب جنوب إفريقيا حتى تحرر، فنحن دائما نفخر كذلك بوقوفكم في جنوب إفريقيا معنا في نضالنا ضد المحتل الإسرائيلي.
And likewise, the Palestinian people stood side by side with the South Africans in their struggle until they were free and liberated. And we therefore appreciate and acknowledge the efforts of the South Africans who continuously and always stand along with us.
وكما انتصرتم في نهاية المطاف على نظام الفصل العنصري، سوف ننتصر على نظام الاحتلال والفصل العنصري الإسرائيلي.
And like you, finally in South Africa were victorious and overcame the apartheid system, likewise we will overcome the occupation and the apartheid in Israel.
إذن النتيجة الواضحة أن المبادئ التي آمن بها نيلسون مانديلا وانتصر بها على نظام الفصل العنصري وحقق الحرية والاستقلال لشعبه العظيم هي ذاتها المبادئ التي تصلح لكل الشعوب والتي يؤمن بها الشعب الفلسطيني وسينتصر من خلالها بإذن الله على الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ونظامه نظام الفصل العنصري.
Therefore, the very principles that Nelson Mandela stood for are the very same principles that the people of Palestine will adhere to, and it's suitable. These principles are suitable for any oppressed nation. In order, by holding on to these, we would then be able to overcome the oppression and the occupation in Palestine, or rather by those perpetrated by Israel.
ولكن أصدقائنا الأعزاء في جنوب إفريقيا ومن خلالكم إلى كل الأحرار في العالم، لا بد أن أذكركم بأن الحالة الفلسطينية مع الاحتلال الصهيوني الإسرائيلي هي حالة أكثر قسوة وأكثر تعقيدا من الحالة التي كانت في جنوب إفريقيا وأي حالة في أي بقعة في العالم.
And he wishes to remind us that in South Africa, that the situation that you find in Palestine with regard to the apartheid and the occupation, etc., is far more complicated and far more difficult than probably what we experienced in South Africa.
بمعنى إسرائيل ليست حالة استعمار اعتيادي فقط.
In that he means that Israel is not simply an occupying nation at all, but suffice with that only.
وليست كذلك مجرد احتلال واستيطان فقط.
And it's not only occupation and settlements.
وليست نظام فصل عنصري فقط.
And it's not a system based on apartheid only.
وليست نظام تطهير عرقي فقط.
And it's not a system based on ethnic cleansing only.
هذا كله موجود وجزء من سلوك إسرائيل ضد الشعب الفلسطيني وضد الأرض الفلسطينية.
All of this is there, but it's only a part of what is present and the whole attempt and effort against the Palestinian people.
ولكن هناك شيء أكثر وأبعد من ذلك.
But there is something bigger and greater than all of it.
إسرائيل فوق كل ما سبق هي نظام إحلال لطرد الشعب الفلسطيني والبقاء في هذه الأرض، بمعنى المعركة الصفرية بيننا وبينهم، هم يقولون إما نحن أو الشعب الفلسطيني.
Israel plans and aims to remove and forcibly remove all of the Palestinians from that particular land, in the sense that what they actually want is it's either them or us. It's not a matter of compromise.
وأصلا عندما أعطاهم بلفور البريطاني قبل 100 عام ويزيد وعده المشؤوم وعد بلفور، كانوا يقولون نحن نذهب إلى أرض ليس فيها شعب.
He says in accordance with the Balfour Declaration of more than 100 years ago, which said almost where he said to them that he's giving them a land where there are no people living on it. There's no nation, or there are no people actually living on it. That's what it was as it was given to them.
ورغم أن الحركة الصهيونية حركة علمانية، لكنها استعملت الدين والدعاوى التاريخية المزيفة في معركتها من أجل هذا الاحتلال والاستيطان.
We know that the Zionist movement is a secular movement, but they used religion to achieve their goals of occupation and expansion of settlements.
وهم الآن يخوضون حقيقة حربا دينية ضد الشعب الفلسطيني.
And now currently they are engaged in a true and real religious war against the Palestinian people.
إضافة إلى كونها حرب عسكرية وسياسية واستيطانية.
In addition to a political and military war as well.
ويستندون كما قلت إلى أوهام تاريخية ليست صحيحة.
And they rely a lot on historical fabricated or false historical information.
ففلسطين هي وطن الشعب الفلسطيني منذ 6000 عام.
So Palestine is the land of the Palestinian people for more than 6,000 years.
وهم اليوم يعتدون على المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية على حد سواء في فلسطين وخاصة في القدس.
And presently they are violating Islamic religious sites as well as Christian religious sites.
قبل شهرين تقريبا ما الذي فجر الحرب الأخيرة؟ إنه الاعتداء الديني على المسجد الأقصى المبارك في أيام رمضان المقدسة عند المسلمين، وكذلك اعتداءهم على حي الشيخ جراح لطرد سكانه منه.
We know what sparked the violence and the conflict about 2 months ago. It was the violation and desecration of Masjid al-Aqsa during the month of Ramadan, and was followed by what happened in the suburb or the region of Sheikh Jarrah.
واليوم وهو يوم مقدس عند المسلمين بين يدي عيد الأضحى المبارك، القوات الإسرائيلية سمحت للمستوطنين وللجماعات الدينية المتطرفة باقتحام الأقصى وأداء طقوسهم الدينية في مقدسات المسلمين.
And today, being one of the holy and sacred days for Muslims, leading the days of Hajj and leading towards Arafat, etc., the Israeli authorities allowed Israeli settlers, to enter the area, the surrounds of Masjid al-Aqsa, and to practice and to carry out some of their religious practices.
ولم تنتهك إسرائيل حرمة المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية في فلسطين فقط، بل اعتدت على الرموز المقدسة والدينية عند المسلمين والمسيحيين، كم اعتدوا كثيرا على النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى النبي عيسى عليه الصلاة والسلام.
So the Israeli authorities did not simply suffice by the desecrating or disrespecting the sites, but even the personalities in the likes of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as Nabi Isa alayhi salam.
وحرقوا من قبل المساجد اللي هي دور العبادة للمسلمين، وحرقوا المصاحف أي القرآن الكريم الكتاب المقدس للمسلمين.
They even burnt masjids as well as they've even burnt copies of the Quran.
بمعنى أن هذا الاحتلال له صبغة استثنائية، أنه لا يصارعنا على الأرض فقط، بل يصارعنا على الدين وعلى المقدسات وعلى التاريخ وعلى الحاضر وعلى المستقبل.
So this occupying force is not simply fighting over land, but they're fighting over religion and all sacred sites and over the past as well as over the future.
نحن كشعب فلسطيني سواء كنا مسلمين أو مسيحيين، نحن نعتز بديننا، ولكننا لسنا متعصبين ولا نعادي الناس بسبب الاختلاف الديني.
So we as the Palestinian people, regardless whether we are Muslim or Christian, respect and honor our religion, and we don't act in a biased or unfair manner towards the other people of other faiths.
ففلسطين تحت حكم شعبها الفلسطيني منذ سنوات بعيدة بل قرون بعيدة كانت أهم نموذج ورمز للتسامح الديني والتعايش بين أصحاب الديانات السماوية.
So Palestine, for not only in recent years, but for even centuries in the past, was a perfect example or a wonderful example of peaceful coexistence between people of different faiths.
والعلاقة بين المسلمين والمسيحيين من أبناء فلسطين منذ التاريخ علاقة نموذجية بفضل الله.
Thus, the example and the relationship between Muslims and Christians for centuries has been a unique and a perfect example for people.
ونحن نقاوم المحتل الإسرائيلي جنبا إلى جنب ونسعى للاستقلال موحدين مسلمين ومسيحيين جنبا إلى جنب.
And thus we will stand side by side, Muslim and Christian, to oppose and resist occupation.
لذلك سياستنا الواضحة، نحن نقاوم الإسرائيليين ليسوا لأنهم يهود ولكن لأنهم محتلون معتدون مستوطنون.
So we are not resisting and opposing Israel because they are Jews, but rather because they are occupiers because they are occupiers.
وبالتالي أصدقائنا الأعزاء، وهذا ختام حديثي معكم، هذه الحالة الاستثنائية لطبيعة المحتل الإسرائيلي أريد تذكيركم بها حتى تعلموا كم نقاسي وكم نعاني وكم هي هذه المعركة القاسية بيننا وبين هذا الكيان الصهيوني الاستعماري الإحلالي الاستيطاني العنصري الذي يعتمد أيضا التطهير العرقي ومحاربتنا في مقدساتنا وفي ديننا ورموزنا مسلمين ومسيحيين.
So finally, to conclude, he says, I wish to remind all of you that the struggle that we face is one that we are facing the Zionist entity who's not only confined to simply occupying the land, but it's including violating religious rights and sacred sites, as well as humanity or apartheid. All of these is a combination of all of that we have to resist and oppose.
ولذلك في يوم مانديلا العظيم ندعوكم يا أصدقائنا الأعزاء في جنوب أفريقيا إلى أن تواصلوا دعمكم لنا، وقوفكم إلى جانبنا حتى نتحرر كما تحررتم بإذن الله.
Therefore, on this day when you are commemorating Nelson Mandela, we ask you to continue supporting us and standing with us until we are liberated the way you had liberated yourselves in South Africa.
وأنا أطمئنكم وأقول لكم بكل ثقة سننتصر على المحتل الإسرائيلي كما انتصرتم على نظام الفصل العنصري في بلادكم بإذن الله.
And he says, I reassure you that we will be victorious over the occupation the same way you were, and inshallah, with the permission of Allah, we will definitely overcome them.
شعبنا الفلسطيني منذ 100 عام وهو يقاتل الاستعمار البريطاني ثم الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ولم يتعب ولم يستسلم شعبنا وسينتصر في نهاية المطاف.
And our Palestinian people since over 100 years have been resisting. They've resisted the British and then they continued their resistance against the Israeli occupation, and we'll continue until we are liberated.
الحرب الأخيرة غير المتكافئة على غزة أعطت رسالة للعالم أن هذا الشعب الفلسطيني شعب عظيم ولا أحد يستطيع أن يهزمه، والمستقبل القريب سيثبت للجميع من وقف معنا ومن ظل يتفرج على معاناتنا أو وقف إلى جانب إسرائيل سيعلم الحقيقة القادمة أن فلسطين ستعيش بدون احتلال واستيطان وستعيش تحت حكم الدولة الفلسطينية لكل أبناء فلسطين بكل حرية وكرامة وتسامح مع الجميع.
Recent events in Gaza showed the world the courage and the bravery of the Palestinian people, and therefore in the coming years or in coming days we'll find out once we overcome the Israeli occupation, we'll realize, or people will see the true colors of those who stood on our side, as well as those who stood on the sidelines and simply applauded or simply watched as spectators, and those who worked against us. All of that will become apparent along with the space of time.
أخيرا فلسطين أرض الأنبياء وأرض الديانات السماوية، وهي أرض السلام، ونحن الفلسطينيين من سيصنع السلام بإذن الله. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
And finally, he says, Palestine is a land of prophets, it's a land of peace, and we in Palestine will work towards re-establishing a peace in that particular land. And he ended up by greeting, Wassalamu alaikum. Shukran.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wa shukran lakum, Habibi. We thank our dear brother and leader, Khalid Mish'al, and I would say comrade in arms,
yes,
for that particular input and for really, in the end, getting the message across that the resistance, even armed resistance, is aimed towards peace and justice in the final analysis, in the tradition of our late founding father, Tata Nelson Mandela. So we want to thank him for that, and our support continues to be with the Palestinian struggle and with the brave struggle that is being waged in Palestine. The next panelist that I'm going to introduce to you is our dear sister Zeenat Adam. She is a strategist in international relations, a thought leader on the affairs in the globe, in our society, somebody who has written various academic papers, been on various platforms, in fact, and with a specialization on the developments in the Middle East and on the African continent. She also worked in the South African Foreign Service, where she focused on the Middle East and on the Horn of Africa. She was a senior diplomat, and she also has been a prominent activist in support of a free Palestine, where she also served as a media spokesperson for the Women's Boat to Gaza, a Freedom Flotilla initiative. It now gives me pleasure to call upon Zeenat Adam to address us.
Jazakallah khair, and thank you for having me on this panel. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all of the panelists and to all of the viewers and listeners in on this webinar. I would like to express my thanks to Fatima and the Sharing Hope Foundation for putting this webinar together. Thank you to the Essa and Fatima Moosa Education Foundation. And of course to our leaders, Brother Khalid Mish'al and Dr. Alan Boesak, who have eloquently drawn a map of our discussions for today. Brother Khalid Mish'al has clearly drawn on the strong Islamic values of equality, of justice, of peace, and how this drives the resistance against ethnic cleansing by the Zionist occupier. Emerging from our own legacy of apartheid, we are acutely aware of the institutionalization and the legalization of a system of deep discrimination and dehumanization of one group of people over another. We are also conscious that the struggle for justice and equality cannot be won by individuals and by men alone, and that it is an ongoing struggle against inequalities. Struggle which is not just won by ballot boxes, but is continuous in delivering justice and equality for all. In South Africa, this has become increasingly evident. While we won some of the battles against apartheid, we are still plagued by the remnants thereof. On this historic day, commemorating the great leader Nelson Mandela, we must acknowledge the sacrifices made by the women in his life, especially by Winnie Madikizela Mandela, without whose struggle to keep his name alive while he was in Robben Island, the world may not have known him. He had been a young political widow, like many Palestinian women whose husbands have been incarcerated. In one of her letters to him, she recalled their wedding, saying, "I knew this was a crown of thorns for me, but I also knew I said I do for better or worse. In marrying you, I was marrying the struggle of my people. Yes, the thorns sometimes pricked so hard that the blood from the wounds covered up my eyes and the excruciating pains blinded me for a while. Although I staggered across the path of freedom with pain, I staggered forward, never doubted my goal, even when the crown was nailed by my people at times, when the tortuous minuted hours, months dragged by gnawing at the inner cores of my soul, I remembered that an army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers will not. These words define for me what the Palestinian struggle has become. In the face of the most sophisticated weaponry, Palestinians stand principled in their conviction and those core values of what ground the struggle, what will win the freedom. When I think of Palestinian women, I don't only remember the revolutionary stalwarts like Leila Khalid. For me, Palestine, her road to freedom, is built on the backs of the grandmothers who are the keepers of history and heritage. Through their storytelling, generations of Palestinian women and men have been rooted in their identities. Think of the paintings of women holding onto olive trees that were uprooted by the Zionist occupiers, the most epic symbol of Palestinians being uprooted from their lands. As the grandmothers have embroidered beautiful threads into their thobes, so have they woven their oral histories into their families, inculcating the struggle ethos into the generations that have followed. From the very first recorded protest in 1893, Palestinian women stood firm against occupation. They went on to demonstrate against the Balfour Declaration, having the foresight that the colonialists were disenfranchising and dispossessing them from their lands and their heritage. In 1929, 9 Palestinian women were killed by the British forces in what became known as the Wailing Wall incident. And then came the Nakba, when they carried their belongings and their children on their backs, seeking refuge from the settler colonial onslaught. They wove into their being and essence the threads that make up the identity of being Palestinian. This day, Nelson Mandela's birthday, was not always a joyous occasion for the Mandela family. As Winnie Mandela noted in a letter to him, the invisible hand which has been directing our lives has made your birthday have tragic memories. It was the same date that I got the painful news of our son, as you got the news of Mama's death on my birthday. Looking back, the strange pattern has been at work for years. Upon receiving news of her incarceration in 1969, Nelson Mandela wrote to her saying, "With the aspirations and views that you hold and the role you are playing in the current battle of ideas, I have always known that you would be arrested sooner or later. I had somehow vaguely hoped that such a calamity would be deferred and that you would be spared the misfortune and misery of prison life. Some time after receiving the news, my faculties seemed to have ceased functioning and turned almost instinctively to your letter, as I have always done in the past whenever my resolution flagged. Most people do not realize that your physical presence would have meant nothing to me if the ideals for which you have dedicated your life have not been realized. I find living in hope the most wonderful thing. Our short lives together, my love, have always been full of expectation. In these hectic and violent years, I have grown to love you more than I ever did before. Nothing can be as valuable as being part and parcel of the formation of the history of a country." What was so beautiful about the relationship between Nelson and Winnie Mandela was that it transcended just personal relations to embody values and ideals of freedom and justice. The tragedy, though, was the impact this had on their family and on their daughters, who spent many formative years without their parents. Just a few days ago, Palestinian prisoner Khalida Jarrar lost her daughter Suha. She was unable to be at her daughter's side in her last moments. She penned this touching tribute behind the prison walls. "I am in so much pain, my child, only because I miss you. I am in so much pain, my child, only because I miss you. From the depths of my agony, I reached out and embraced the sky of our homeland through the window of my prison cell in Damon Prison, Haifa. Worry not, my child. I stand tall, steadfast, despite the shackles and the jailer. I am a mother in sorrow from yearning to see you one last time. This doesn't happen except in Palestine. All I wanted was to bid my daughter a final farewell with a kiss on her forehead and to tell her I love her as much as I love Palestine. My daughter, forgive me for not attending the celebration of your life, that I was not beside you during this heartbreaking and final moment. My heart has reached the heights of the sky, yearning to see you, caress and plant a kiss on your forehead through the small window of my prison cell. Suha, my precious, have stripped me from bidding you a final goodbye kiss. I bid you farewell with a flower. Your absence is searingly painful, excruciatingly painful, but I remain steadfast and strong like the mountains of beloved Palestine. My heart breaks reading this. Zionist occupiers are fully aware, as the apartheid government was, of how to break people down through not only physical torture that would destroy Palestinian bodies, but to break their spirit by dividing families and perpetrating emotional torture on them. Have been deliberate acts of rendering women powerless, uneducated, perpetuating stereotypes of Orientalism and fetishization of Palestinian women. Women stood firm and strong in demanding justice as women would isolate their efforts to free children and young men from the hands of incarceration. This morning, we heard of Zionist settlers escorted by military personnel entering Al-Aqsa compound, attacking Palestinian women, while Palestinian youth were prevented from entering while reciting takbirat. In these days of Hajj, I am reminded of the sacrifices of the beloved Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. And as our Muslim brothers and sisters emulate the acts in these days, we must acknowledge the sacrifices of our mother Hajar. In the same spirit, I wish to commemorate the courage and bravery of Palestinian women who have sacrificed. We cannot forget Ahad Tamimi. We must remember and honor Fatima Barnawi, the first Palestinian woman guerrilla fighter. We must pay homage to Razan al-Najjar, the young paramedic killed while treating the protesters in the Great March of Return. We must honor the smile of Maryam Afifi, who ignited hope in us as she was arrested by the occupying forces. And we must imbue in ourselves celebratory songs women of Gaza sang to the mothers of the martyrs. I will leave you with the words of Rafiq Ziadeh. I am an Arab woman of color, and we come in all shades of anger. So let me just tell you, this womb inside of me will only bring you your next rebel. She'll have a rock in one hand and a Palestinian flag in the other. I am an Arab woman of color. Beware, beware my anger. Shukran.
Well, Ahsan, mashallah, really, really, really touching and moving. And we thank you, Sister Zainab, Sister Zeenat, for that. And particularly for drawing also the parallels with the struggle that Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela went through as well. Really, and the ending really, really inspiring, the role of women in this particular struggle. Thank you very much. Just to announce as well, there is a chat function in the Zoom where brothers and sisters are welcome to basically post questions, and those questions will be responded to by the panel. Unfortunately, I just have to announce that Brother Khalid Mishal has had to leave. He's got another engagement, but the questions will also be sent to him, and the sharing of Hope Facebook page and social media platform will share those responses. I also see Sheikh Riyad Fattar from the Muslim Judicial Council as well in the audience. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sheikh, and welcome to you as a strong supporter of the Palestinian struggle.
Thank you very much, Brother Shuaib. Excuse me, I should leave now because I should engage in another meeting.
Inshallah. Shukran. Shukran.
Thank you very much,
brother.
brothers and sisters. Salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
See you in Palestine, inshallah. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Fi amanillah.
Salaam alaikum.
Alaikum salam. We now call upon our next panelist, Brother Thembisa Fakude. He's a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogue Center. He's also a research fellow of the Asharq Forum, and he's a columnist in various newspapers. He's also on the board of the Mail and Guardian newspaper. He'll speak to us very much from a media angle, what's been happening in the media space. So we look forward now to listening to Brother Thembisa. Take us forward. Shukran.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm honored to share this space with some of my heroes, particularly Dr. Alan Boesak, whom I admired for a better part of my life as an activist in South Africa and later on as a journalist. And I'm also honored to have shared this space with Abu Walid, Khalid Mishal, whom I spent a bit of interesting time with in Doha, where I work as a journalist and as a researcher. My topic is about how the media has, to an extent, changed its stance on how it has been covering the Palestinian cause. The first point I would like to make is about the song that was composed by a South African musician called Jerusalem. This was very important because for once it explained the importance of Al-Quds to the people of South Africa and the world, that it's not only important as a physical space to those people who live there and those people who were killed, who were kicked out of their homes and who continue to be kicked out of their homes in Al-Quds, which is Jerusalem, but it's also a spiritual home for all of us. And the song demonstrated that importance. Everybody danced to it, from Korea to South Africa, and people began to once again understand the Palestinians joined in, the Jews joined in the dance. So it was an important media exercise, particularly by those who continued to propagate it through the social media. And it also amplified the name of Jerusalem, which to most people has been associated with violence and strife. But for once, it resonated to most of us as our spiritual home, at least for those of us who don't have a physical presence there, who live outside that part of the world, that there is a place called Jerusalem. And if you go to Black communities in South Africa, there are various versions of Jerusalem sung in different churches. And people always call Jerusalem their home. So this is one point which I think I'll open this discussion with. The media, when it comes to Palestine, was for a long time covering the story as a religious conflict. But with the advent of institutions such as Al Jazeera, the narrative turned into a human rights cause, which was for a better part of the coverage ignored. Al Jazeera, for example, went on to establish another department called Al Jazeera Mubashir, which was mainly meant to cover the ongoing struggle of the Palestinians. This happened way before Google Live and YouTube Live and Facebook Live. Al Jazeera was already in the forefront of ensuring that the cameras were kept rolling at any given time when there was a protest in Palestine or when there was a conference taking place in Palestine, particularly organized by Hamas, who were for a better part of their existence, at least before the advent of social media, and Al Jazeera Mubashir and Al Jazeera in general, were not covered properly by the media. So the advent of Al Jazeera Mubashir changed that situation. And for once, we saw the normalization of the Palestinian cause and also an inclusive coverage of the Palestinian cause, bringing to the public characters that were previously ignored, particularly those of the Islamic movement, whether it was Islamic Jihad or Hamas. For once, they were now involved and covered by the mainstream media. which in the past concentrated only on Fatah or the PLO representative of the Palestinian cause. So I will say that Al Jazeera to an extent did manage to change the coverage of the Palestinian cause, and it continues to do so. So you have, after that, many other media institutions, not only in the Middle East, but also throughout the world, who have followed suit to cover the Palestinian cause as an important story. One of those is the institution I'm also associated with called Middle East Monitor, which has amplified once again the atrocities that are taking place in Palestine, but also help articulate the political ideology and positions of various organizations and political organizations inside Palestine. The other issue, which I think is very important, is that the Palestinian diaspora, particularly the young people who were born outside Palestine, who are of Palestinian descent, have also assisted in changing the narrative of Palestine, particularly those who are based and socialized and politicized in the West and in Europe. They've communicated a different form of a Palestinian story, that which we were not used to before. And they've also managed to present a diverse views or political views of what Palestinian cause is all about. Most of us always see Palestine as groups that, you know, are just fighting an unarmed struggle, but there are a lot of other diverse political ideologies and views inside Palestine, which I think the young diaspora has have managed to present. And we've seen that happening, particularly now following the recent bombardment and onslaught on the innocent people of Gaza. We've seen how these young activists have managed to articulate a very important position and voice to the larger global populations. And that has helped to an extent of turning the narrative, which has often kind of demonized the Palestinians as people who are hell-bent on violence and people who are hell-bent or not interested in pushing peace in that part of the world. So that's been an interesting advent as well with the young Palestinian diaspora who are now articulating a new position. But also what I think is important is the presence of the Palestinians inside the newsrooms of important organizations, whereas in the past, the editorial direction was to an extent controlled by people who did not necessarily understand the Palestinian cause, and most of whom were of European or outside Palestinian descent. Now you have many Palestinians who are participating and working within the influential news organizations throughout the world. We know, for example, of the discussions that continually take place inside our newsrooms at Al Jazeera, where there is a constant articulation of position, including the wording on what to call certain acts and how to call certain people who are engaged either in the Palestinian cause or who are activists of the Palestinian cause. So that has helped also to fine-tune the narrative that has been coming from the broader newsrooms. And as a result, you have other media organizations following suit, particularly if the big four, which is CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Sky, articulate a certain position. The trend has been that other smaller news organizations tend to follow suit. And what we've seen is the turning of tide in terms of how the Palestinian struggle has been communicated to the wider audiences. So that has been positive. The other important issue, I've touched on it already briefly, is the liberalization of the communication waves or media waves, particularly with the advent of social media. We have seen activists throughout the world articulating a new position on Palestine, and that has helped communicate the Palestinian cause. The last Gaza onslaught on Palestinians has given rise to a number of online activists, and most of whom have pushed the brutal Israeli regime against the wall, because in the past they've used to manage to win the narrative because they controlled, by and large, the number of media organizations. In other words, most of the senior editors and journalists who work for the big institutions were, to an extent, biased or in favor of the narrative that pushed Israel as a victim. But with this liberalization of the online waves and spaces, we've seen young people and old people communicating a different view about what's happening in Palestine. And that, to an extent, has also assisted in isolating Israel, but also pushing a new narrative about Palestine. Finally, I think also what has happened with the liberalization and opening of the media for Palestinians, it has also forced and encouraged many academic institutions to begin to invite other voices from Palestine to come and speak and articulate their political positions on Palestine. In the past, it was rare to have Abu Walid or Khalid Mishal or any of the representatives from the Islamic movement or Ikhwan Muslimin participating in conferences. I used to be part of those who came up with conferencing that were specifically meant to give spaces for those who didn't have voices. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is that many conferences now are open and they feel much more comfortable. And this is because of the example that institutions such as the one that I continue to represent and worked for a very long time managed to ensure that you normalize the Palestinian cause and you normalize the Palestinian struggle. But at the same time, you give a reasoning on why the Palestinians do what they do and why it's important for the world to support what Palestinians are doing. So in closing, I am of the view that the Palestinian cause moving forward and the Palestinian political understanding moving forward is likely to change and to shift. I'm not saying it was not okay for where the Palestinian cause used to reside, which was a religious sphere, but now the Palestinian cause is much more diverse, and as a result, many people from different persuasions feel and understand why they should join the Palestinian cause and why they should push for human rights in Palestine and eventual freedom of the people of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input, Brother Thembisa, really coming from the media angle, and we have seen those changes in the media space, and I think it is quite positive. Before going into, because I see there's quite a number of inputs and questions on the Zoom link, as well as on YouTube. I'm going to hand over to the respondent, Brother Naeem Jeenah. He's going to respond to the inputs. I'm now going to call him. Brother Naeem Jeenah is the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle Eastern Center in Johannesburg, and he's also a prominent activist for the freedom of Palestine, prominent activist on social justice issues in South Africa, also somebody who sacrificed for the liberation and freedom of South Africa. And I'll call upon Brother Naeem Jeenah to address us and to respond to some of the matters that were raised in the inputs. Thank you.
Shukran, Khalid, and thank you to the two foundations that are hosting this event. Let me get straight into it. I have 4 inputs to deal with and to respond to in a very short time. So let me get straight into it. Let me begin with the input by Khalid Mishal. His beginning, I think, really encapsulated for us as South Africans, and generally for people of the South, what solidarity means. Khalid Mishal began his input with an expression of solidarity for the difficulties that South Africa has been going through, particularly in the past week. Those of us who are South African know that this has been an extremely painful and difficult period for us, especially the past week or just over a week. And the notion that oppressed people express solidarity with each other, that solidarity is not about those who are more privileged giving to those who are less privileged, but those who are people who face difficulty and are oppressed being in solidarity with each other, I think is extremely important. For Palestinians to express solidarity with South Africans highlights this point, and the point that Samora Machel made about international solidarity, that it is not an act of charity, but it is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the same objectives. So I just wanted to highlight that I think that as South Africans who, and those of us who are on the panel now, in a sense, all of us, I think this webinar is us taking a break from South Africa in order to focus on something else, on Palestine. As South Africans, this expression of solidarity from occupied, colonized, and oppressed Palestinians, I think is very welcome. I was keen to hear what Khalid Mishal had to say about the ethos of Nelson Mandela as it relates to the Palestinians. I didn't expect that he would talk about what Mandela's ethos meant for a free Palestine, and in that I wasn't surprised. He spoke about what Mandela's ethos means for Palestinians in struggle. And what is important about the way that he presented this, and clearly the way his movement sees what Mandela means for it and for the struggle, is that he moved away from this, or he didn't buy in to this kind of liberal notion of Mandela as this non-violent, peacemaking, hugging teddy bear. That for him, Mandela was much more than that. That Mandela was, for Mandela, peace was about justice. For Mandela, achieving peace was about resistance. And let me, you know, it brought to mind a quote from Mandela around the issue of resistance. And we know, of course, that Mandela was imprisoned because he was a founder of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress. But in 1999, so not as a founder of Umkhonto we Sizwe, not as a president of the ANC, but in 1999, as the president of the Republic of South Africa, Mandela was seated next to Yasser Arafat in Gaza. And in that, or at that event, he declared, and I quote here, "All men and women with vision choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases where we cannot proceed, where we cannot move forward. Then, if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence." I think this is an important understanding of Mandela's legacy in terms of what resistance means for liberation and for freedom from oppression. The notion that there cannot be peace without justice, there cannot be peace under occupation, that resistance is a right, etc., are all, I think, that we appreciate from how Khalid Mishal understands the legacy of Nelson Mandela. I think it's we shouldn't allow the legacy of Mandela to be distorted and undermined. Madiba was not the big teddy bear who who gave into whatever white people wanted. He was a freedom fighter. He also made important points about the difference between the Palestinian and South African struggle. Of course, that in the Palestinian struggle, for example, the idea is not to just subjugate Palestinians, as was the case in South Africa with Black people, but in fact to remove them and to remove them completely. Alan Boesak, of course, took us back to particularly the 1980s. For some of us, a nostalgic journey, Reverend Boesak. I want to raise one or two points, though, about what was said. Firstly, the notion of unity in struggle and unity in the ranks of the oppressed. An important notion, Reverend Boesak, but to be honest, I think we South Africans sometimes fetishize this notion of unity to beyond its usefulness. We did not have, yes, the UDF was the largest front of organizations in South Africa in the 1980s struggling against apartheid. But we did not have unity, as you yourself admitted, Reverend Boesak. We did not have unity among the oppressed people in South Africa. Yet there was a common vision, a common kind of broad strategy that even while we were fighting each other, we were able to do it within that broad strategy that we all agreed on and towards that vision that we, in a sense, all agreed on. And so I think that for Palestinians, when this notion of unity comes up, it needs to be a more pragmatic understanding of what unity means. Unity in vision, unity in strategy is important. Unity organizationally, maybe not. Just an important point, I think. And we South Africans that look back nostalgically to our struggle often talk in this kind of way about unity that is not necessarily helpful for other people. One point Reverend Boesak missed out that I thought is important in the context of the Palestinian struggle is the role of white people in the UDF in particular, because that's what he spoke about, but in general in the South African struggle. I think this is an important part of our history, not a forgotten part. I mean, it's discussed often. A lot has been written about it. The role of white people within the UDF inside the country and other organizations, of course, the trade unions, etc. But also the role of white people outside South Africa in the armed struggle, in the Communist Party, etc. The reason I'm focusing on this in a sense is because I think that this is a debate that Palestinians or in certain sections, Palestinians still have about the role of Jewish Israelis in the struggle for a free Palestine, and a discussion that is a useful South African Palestinian discussion to be had, and exchanging ideas about this, about what that kind of role was in the South African context and whether that has any relevance. And I'm not saying it does necessarily, but whether that has any relevance for Palestinians seeking a free Palestine as Black South Africans were seeking a free South Africa. Clearly from both Reverend Boesak's contribution and Khalid Mishal's contribution, one of the kind of slogans, Reverend Boesak, that came to my mind, I think originating from your part of the country, that I'm sure that Khalid Mishal and his comrades will agree with: freedom or death, victory is certain. So it would have been nice, Reverend Boesak, if you, at our old age, if we still were to say these kinds of slogans. Zeenat's very, very passionate and somewhat emotional, or emotive, I should say, presentation, I think, touched all of us. But speaking about the role of women and the often ignored, not all the time, but often ignored role of women in our struggles. Certainly the role of women is not completely ignored in the Palestinian struggle, but I think in all struggles, there is much more focus and attention given to men that are involved in struggle. But more importantly, I think what Zeenat points to is that there is often too much attention and focus given to leaders and celebrities in our struggle. And that often struggles are won by ordinary people whose names do not appear on pamphlets, whose names do not appear in books, who don't give big speeches necessarily, but who are the people on the ground who do the work that makes revolution happen and that makes liberation possible. This, I think, remains for South Africans an important lesson in our ongoing struggles. It certainly is an important lesson for Palestinians. I'm not saying that it is, as I said, something that is completely ignored, but I think that it is easy for us to often slip into celebrating leaders and celebrities and forgetting to celebrate the ordinary people. And I say this on a day, of course, that we're celebrating the birthday of one of the greatest South African icons / leaders / celebrities, if you like. So I think, Zeenat, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind of reminder about the role of the forgotten strugglers amongst us. And as I'm coming to the end, because I don't have much time left, Thembisa's focus on the media, and an important part, of course, particularly right now, following what happened in Gaza about 2 months ago. And we saw, following that onslaught on Gaza, but not just on Gaza as with previous onslaughts on Gaza, that onslaught on Gaza, on Jerusalem, on Palestinians in the 48 territories, in the West Bank, etc., this comprehensive onslaught that took place and the comprehensive resistance of Palestinians in May, we saw in many ways how the media narrative kind of changed around the Palestinian issue. Often these kinds of changes in media and discourse are slow, incremental changes that take a long time and that are barely noticeable. In May, I think we saw changes that were quite noticeable, quite suddenly, even in mainstream media in the United States, for example. And that, part of it, as Thembisa pointed out, was the role of so-called diaspora Palestinians. But I think that various other role players as well were involved in helping to make that change. One point that Thembisa made, which I kind of smiled at, he started off with a point about Jerusalem, the song and dance, if you like. And I just want to say that the whole Jerusalem phenomenon in terms of the Palestinian struggle could really have turned out completely differently than it did. In fact, it was the Israeli apologists and pro-Israeli lobbies, both in Palestine as well as in South Africa, that took interest in the Jerusalem song before Palestinians and the Palestinian Solidarity Movement did. And were willing to spend lots of money to co-opt the Jerusalem song into a pro-Israeli agenda. It was only because of a few individuals and 1 or 2 organizations that then saw the significance of Jerusalem as a pro-Palestinian tool, that it moved in that direction. But the interesting point about this is that various forms of media can often or are often on a cusp where they can go in one or the other direction. And it is often complacency that allows them to be misused in the cause of oppression rather than in the cause of liberation. And finally, my last point about Thembisa's input and the issue of the media is, despite what we've said about how the media narrative might be changing post the attacks of May 2 months ago, let us remember that in terms of social media, which Thembisa spoke much about, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Zoom, all of these remain very pro-Israeli. That pro-Palestinian tweets and Facebook posts, etc., are routinely taken down. That it was not too long ago, certainly before May, but not too long ago, when neither Zoom nor Facebook nor YouTube would allow webinars that featured Leila Khalid on them. That these forms of media, even if we talk about social media as being more democratized because more people have a voice in them, that they remain resolutely anti-Palestinian. And so let us not become complacent about the role that these kind of media play in terms of the agenda of supporting occupation, colonialism, and imperialism. Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, Fatima, and thanks for this opportunity to engage with these four speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Naeem for the responses. I think quite a comprehensive response, and I think really getting us into a space also of reality, of understanding the current material conditions, even the reality of our struggle in South Africa and the nuances. I think a very, very nuanced response, because I think nuance is important if we ought to craft our way forward in terms of struggle. There are a couple of questions, not too many. I'll start off with questions that were posted on the YouTube. Just let me get to those. So on the YouTube link, there was a question. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but perhaps there can be a response to it, to say that, let me just get to it. Okay. Stating that amongst the multi-level approach to achieve freedom in Palestine, the Palestinian Christian narrative has got an important contribution to make to counter the Christian Zionist narrative, particular narrative that we've seen here in South Africa as well. Not to change the interpretation of the biblical text, but to help Zionists acknowledge. So the question there was, is it not a good idea for Hamas to actually include on its media platforms various Palestinian Christian leaders and put forward a clearly identified Palestinian Christian to actually address Western media? That's one of the, that's the only question that we picked up on the YouTube. In terms of Zoom, okay, there was a comment around that there's a 12-year-old Palestinian rapper on YouTube. We must all try to find the link, and I think the link can possibly be posted here by Fatima, and we must look at that. Okay, the other question is there any way to hold the United Nations accountable for ignoring human rights in Palestine and the world in general, for the economic oppression of the Palestinians? There's also a question tied to that, questioning the fact that, noting that Nelson Mandela was declared a terrorist by the Western world. And why is it that Hamas, that's pursuing a similar struggle of Umkhonto we Sizwe, are still considered to be terrorists? And what is the way in which we can ensure that the international community no longer uses that tag? Then the other question we received was, was Hamas not meant to open an office in South Africa? I recall those discussions that were made quite public, and what is the status in that regard? Those are the questions that we've got currently. Anybody from the panel would like to respond?
Sorry, I think for the ones directed to Hamas, I will send it to them and then we can get the responses.
But I think also what we can do is, I think it would be also interesting for the panel to also reflect on it as well. I think if they would like to reflect, they're more than welcome. So if we could start off, anybody wants to kick us off with the response?
Khalid, let me just say something quickly. I need to go because I need to join a national prayer service for the country, and they have started at noon already. So my excuses for not being able to respond fully. I would like to have said something about what Naeem Jeenah had said about the United Democratic Front in those times, but we don't have time. Let me just say that I think the idea that Hamas should find a clear Christian voice in Palestine would be very, very helpful indeed. The World Communion of Reformed Churches, of which I am a part and whose president I used to be in the 1980s, have these series of conversations about the situation in the world now under the impact of the coronavirus. But we met with Middle Eastern people the other day, and young Christians from churches in Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Gaza and so forth. And they have put forward a very, very persuasive case for a unity. There goes that word again, Mr. Jeenah, that unity that is needed and that is in fact displayed every single day. And I was thinking, they're all very young, they're all very articulate, and I was thinking how much that would be helpful for people in the West who are within the Christian community to hear those voices and to have those voices amplified. I'm thinking also of the World Council of Churches, who for years now have organized a pilgrimage to Palestine, led by Palestinians once they are there, to sort of counter these Holy Land tours that some of the churches used to do, and to get the information not just from that side of the fence, but also from the heart of the Palestinians themselves. And those pilgrimages bring back young people who changed the narrative, not only within the churches, but in academic institutions, as our brother Thembisa has so eloquently explained. And that is what is needed much more. And those voices have to be strengthened. And so that is what I would like to respond to and support that idea. But I will unfortunately have to leave you now to join my other commitment for the Sunday. So I thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you, and I wish you well as I continue to be in solidarity with all of us, as we are in solidarity with Palestine. Thank you so very much. We'll talk again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boesak, and we thank you for your time and effort. Yeah, and we pray for your continued health. Thank you. Anybody else who wants to respond, particularly, could we get a response as well on the issue around Hamas and the branding as a terrorist organization, and also the issue around the United Nations, how to hold it accountable? Could we possibly get a response? I'm interested, maybe Zeenat can respond around the United Nations issue, given her experience in the diplomatic community. Zeenat?
I think that if we look at the United Nations, we have to understand that there is a definite requirement for...
Okay, you can continue, Zeenat.
May I go ahead? So I would look at it holistically, that the United Nations in its formation was done so with extreme bias. And that is the reason why we have a Security Council with permanent 5 that is not representative of the rest of the world, and certainly not representative of the dynamics that we face with currently as a global community. For decades now, as South Africans, and including other countries around the world from the global South, have been pushing for the reform of the United Nations so that it is more fair, it does take into account the difficulties and the challenges faced by the global South, and it includes and has representation. Now, that hasn't quite happened as yet. We also need to consider that the United Nations is not just the Security Council and the General Assembly. There are other wings to the United Nations, and in the case of Palestine, UNRWA has been very, very instrumental in addressing some of the atrocities that had taken place. And in fact, when funding was stopped to UNRWA, it had a huge impact on how people in Gaza were able to mitigate against the kind of onslaught from the Zionists. So it is a very complex issue. I do think that there needs to be accountability. And most importantly, there needs to be reform of the United Nations. In addition to that, in this last, in May, there were attempts through the ICC and through international courts and to invoke the Rome Statute in various countries, including in the EU, here in South Africa, to have some investigations into the atrocities that are being perpetrated by the Zionists against the Palestinians, and to hold them accountable. The challenge that we faced with that is that the Israelis do not recognize the ICC, and so that puts in play a bit of a difficult situation, but the pressure remains there. For example, in South Africa with the Gaza docket, and reigniting that more recently, the most important thing in trying to have accountability is documentation of those atrocities and identifying people who can come forward and say, this has happened to me, and I would like to hold these perpetrators accountable. So inshallah, it is a long process to have such legal instruments in place, but inshallah, there will be some recourse.
Inshallah, shukran for that. Any response perhaps from Thembisa regarding the issue of Hamas and a terrorist organization, given the kind of media discourse that you spoke about, Thembisa?
Yeah, I think it's slowly changing because of those efforts, particularly by the diaspora who are in charge of that activism in the West, where those noises are coming from. So many of these people are now beginning to articulate a new position. But also, as I said in my presentation, the involvement of the Islamic movement and members of Hamas in various conferencing has also helped, because they are now beginning to articulate a true position on who they are. And that is helping to an extent, especially at academic platforms and spaces. The narrative of Hamas being a terrorist organization is changing. Many people are beginning to interact and deal with Hamas up close. They get to know who these people are, and they can, on a first-hand basis, get to understand that this is not a true portrayal of a terrorist when they meet the activists and members of Hamas, for example. So it is changing, but the fact that we have people representing Hamas also featuring on mainstream media, wearing suits and ties, also helps. That these are not people who are just wearing turbans and carrying AK-47s and shooting people around. That has also continued to help. So I think it's slowly changing in many institutions, and inshallah it will continue to change as Hamas continues to embrace new other positions, which again there's been problems with Hamas in terms of articulating a new position and in terms of acclimatizing to the realities that are sometimes required by mainstream media in terms of how you do PR, etc. But we see that happening now. They're employing more and more young people who are doing a very good job in terms of, at least fine-tuning their position. So with all of those efforts, I think things will change, inshallah.
Thanks so much, Brother Thembisa, for that response. I think quite a comprehensive response. I just want to possibly get Brother Naeem to respond, not that he's a representative of government to anything, but as a commentator and as an analyst, just to respond possibly to the question around the status of the Hamas office in South Africa, and in his view, what could be the rationale as to why the office is not here yet? If you could maybe just, maybe just touch on that, Brother Naeem.
Khalid, what makes you think that's a question I'd be able to answer? Firstly, I'm not in government, but I'm not even in the ANC. And the agreement about the office was made between Hamas and the ANC. Subsequently, the ANC came under substantial attack for that decision, or that offer actually, that was made at the time by Gwede Mantashe to Hamas. And the pressure on the ANC to not allow Hamas to open an office came actually more from a number of Arab embassies in South Africa than it did from the Israelis or the Americans or anyone else. Whether Hamas is still going to open an office or not remains to be seen. I think the past year has been a difficult year for everyone in terms of traveling, etc. So we'll see when things kind of normalize whether that's still going to happen or not. But it's been 3 or 4 years and there's been no progress on that. So I don't know whether that still is part of the plan. I do know that they have a much more significant focus on the African continent now than they did about 5 years ago. But whether that means that they're still looking at opening an office in South Africa, I don't know, we'll see. But let me speak to one other point, Khalid. The question about holding the UN responsible reminded me of one other point I wanted to make in my response. And that is that none of the South Africans on this panel actually spoke about what South Africa's responsibility is in terms of the Mandela ethos in supporting the Palestinian struggle. Mandela's notion of international solidarity, Mandela's support, even as I quoted, in 1999 for Palestinian armed struggle, or the term he used, violence. What obligation does that place on us as South Africans? What obligation does that place on our government in its support of the Palestinian people, both as a state locally, but also in terms of international fora like the United Nations, the African Union, etc. And I think that this is, for us South Africans, this is a critical and an important question. So yes, one of the things South Africa currently is doing is that it has finally, 26 years after our first democratic elections, has finally decided at cabinet level, and is going to be approved in Parliament, to sign and ratify the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. This is a good step. Of course, it should have been done in 1994, but it is a good step, and it is a good step in making the point that for South Africa, the state that was quintessentially apartheid, that for South Africa, the understanding is that apartheid continues to exist in other parts of the world, and certainly one of the targets of that will be the Israeli state. So I think that this is a good first step in that regard. But, you know, our trade relations with Israel continue to be pretty strong. Even if we don't have an ambassador in Tel Aviv at the moment, most of our parastatals, security systems are Israeli made. We just had an Israeli-led company or Israeli-led consortium buying out Clover Dairies, which has been an iconic South African dairy. All of us on this platform, including Reverend Boesak, who just left, all of us grew up drinking Clover milk. And that has been bought over by an Israeli consortium, and you know that was allowed to happen. The billing records of our telecommunications company that's owned by the government, owned by the state rather, Telkom, that billing is done by an Israeli company, and our records are located in Israel. What are we doing as South Africans in a concrete way, apart from giving good speeches and taking sometimes good resolutions? What are we doing in a concrete way to support the Palestinian struggle? So Khalid, the only politician on this platform is you. So perhaps we can make you the target of this. But this is the question I think that we need to answer. Zeenat responded about the United Nations, and I think that South Africa has a role to play as well in the term that was used in the question, in holding the UN responsible, but in promoting the Palestinian cause at the United Nations. South African liberation owed a good deal to the structures that were set up in the United Nations and the assistance that those structures provided to the international anti-apartheid movement, the Special Committee Against Apartheid, for example, the Center Against Apartheid. A country like South Africa, together with other countries of the global South that support the Palestinian cause, need to take this cause up in the General Assembly, even if the UN Security Council is a problem, and to ensure that similar kinds of things are set up to support the Palestinian struggle. Rather, what we are seeing is that Palestinian solidarity from states, at any rate, is decreasing in the global South, is decreasing on the African continent. I mean, no one in their right mind could suggest that either India or Brazil, the states that is, today support the Palestinians. No one in their right mind can suggest that the majority of African countries support the Palestinians. Most recently with the normalization deals by Sudan and Morocco with Israel. So I think that the task is huge, and that places a greater burden on a country like South Africa to take up the cudgels in support of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle. And that means all of us that live in this state, our citizens, have that responsibility as well.
Thank you so much, Naeem. I think very important that you've alluded very clearly to the responsibility not only of South Africans, but ourselves who are in political office as well, because it's not enough making flowery speeches, standing in marches, but then not fighting the practical fight in the site of struggle in which we do find ourselves. So I think that's an important message that must most certainly be taken forward, particularly given the kind of influence and presence that the apartheid state has got in South Africa, the apartheid that Israel has in South Africa, which you've just mentioned now, and on the continent. We've also got another member of parliament here as well, Hanif Hendricks, who I'm sure will also take up quite a few of the issues at the national level. The final two questions, and we are going to wrap up on that, and I'm going to ask, and they both in a sense flow from what was raised now by Naeem. The final two questions would be on the South African issue as to what can South African government do more than what it is already doing, and civil society to actually stem the advances that Israel is making basically on the continent and here in South Africa, and not just just in terms of further pressure The other question is, what is the impact of some of the, and it was spoken to now by Naeem, what has been the impact of some of the normalization by the Arab countries, the normalization of the relations with Israel? What has that impact had on the Palestinian struggle? I'm going to ask Thembisa and Zeenat to respond before I hand over for the final remarks. Okay.
Well, thank you, Khalid. I think the normalization has had a very negative impact on the Palestinian cause, because it continues to encourage others, and it's important because the country that has led this is the United Arab Emirates, which has, well, at least before some couple of weeks, had a strong sway to Saudi Arabia, and they are also continuing to be a power broker within the GCC, which is also going to have an impact on particularly the financial assistance coming from within Arab countries towards Palestine. Notwithstanding that countries like Qatar have continued to take a standalone position, it's not far-fetched to imagine that they will also feel the pressure not long from now to begin to kind of normalize relations with Israel. And when that happens, it will be a sad day indeed. We have seen that Saudi Arabia has moved, and those attempts are at advanced stage now in terms of normalizing relations. They have not necessarily articulated an official position on when that will happen, but it's all systems goes. They continue to interact politically, socially, and economically with Israel. And we can all assume that Saudi Arabia has normalized relations with Israel, even though they have not necessarily officially articulated the position. And that will indeed put pressure on other countries in the Gulf and indeed in the Middle East, as I've said earlier on, because of the financial muscle that all of these countries combined have. So that will be very sad indeed. But we also must not ignore the role of some of the Palestinians in the strife and the challenges of normalization, particularly people like Mohammed Dahlan, who happens to be one of the senior members within Fatah and PLO, and who's also touted as the next leader of the Fatah if Mr. Abu Mazen and Mahmoud Abbas vacates his position, which he refuses to do. So when that happens, we are likely to see another dynamic within Palestine, bringing at least for now, the main player who is encouraged by many people to maintain that position so that, of course, they can control the Palestinian position and politics, which is Fatah. If that happens and Mohammed Dahlan becomes the leader of the Fatah movement and, of course, rise into being the leader of a PLO, we are facing a serious challenge and an unknown future. So those are the challenges that we see. As long as we have people inside Palestine, or the body politic of the Palestinians in the form of people like Mohammed Dahlan and others within Fatah movement who are working very closely with the United Arab Emirates, which is the architect of this move of normalization, and Saudi Arabia, it's likely that we are going to have another challenging situation in Palestine.
Thank you so much for the response. Can I hand over now to Zeenat? Zeenat, your response. I mean, maybe you can also touch a lot on the role that South Africa and South Africans can play.
Shukran, Khalid. I think I want to also speak to some of the points that Thembisa had raised regarding the normalization with Israel and the recognition of the Zionist entity. Of course, this is exposing the Arab world for what had already been doing in the past. It's not something new, it's just now been made public. What pains me, though, is that we have a number of African countries who have followed suit. And when I look back in history, the Palestinians held such high esteem in Africa and at the African Union, or previously the OAU. We have been losing that kind of dynamic within the AU over the last decade or so. And that is purely due to the Israeli lobby machine that has been put into place and that holds a number of these countries to ransom through economic sanctions or through lucrative economic deals that are taking place. And it becomes very difficult for these African countries to turn away from that. What I think we were supposed to have been discussing today from the topic was the ethos of Nelson Mandela. And if we return to that and to the values and the principles, what we're realizing is that through these normalization deals, those values, the ethos, the principles of human rights, of justice, of equality are being set aside in favor of economic development. And South Africa has held its principled position. And make no mistake that the pressure has been very strong on the South African economy from the Israelis. And Naeem spoke to that we continue to do deals with Israel, mega millions of deals. And that compromises us in our principle. It compromises us in our ethos and in our drive for justice and equality. Where we need to be working really hard is the counter lobby in Africa. And what South Africa really needs to be doing is to be speaking regularly at the African Union and lobbying our partners in Africa, get them to understanding why the Palestinian question is so critical. But it also speaks to who we hold as our friends. If we continue to play in the field with fascists like India and Brazil, how do we expect to hold a moral high ground? And I think this means that we need to question ourselves. Here in South Africa, I think that our solidarity movement is very strong. We continue to apply pressure on government, and government has tried to take the right kind of decisions. There are still some areas where I think we could be stronger and where we could be leading. And we need to continue to examine that. But what we also have to be conscious of is the surveillance state. We need to be conscious of the intelligence mechanisms that have been put in play in our own communities, and to be wary of collaborators who may be here in South Africa, but also of those who are acting in the rest of the world against the very principles and values that we stand for. Shukran.
Shukran so much, Afwan, for that input, and I think very, very important. What I'm going to do, just as we are now closing, is to get each speaker, each panelist, just to give us their closing remarks, final message, very, very brief. And then straight after that, to hand over to Fatima for a very, very brief vote of thanks. So I'm going to start with Naeem, then I'm going to hand over to Thembisa, and then to Zeenat, and then thereafter Fatima. Thank you so much.
Shukran, Khalid, but I think I've said everything I wanted to say.
Shukran so much. Brother Thembisa.
Thank you very much, Khalid and the organizers, and thanks for inviting me. It's been a very good meeting for all of us.
Shukran. Thank you so much, Brother Thembisa. Sister Zeenat.
Just a special thanks to Fatima for arranging all of this. Shukran to all the panelists, and inshallah we continue the revolutionary spirit that we are commemorating today. Jazakallahu khair.
Barakallahu fikum. Fatima, your vote of thanks or final remarks on behalf of the hosts?
Yes, thank you, Khalid, for being such an astute moderator for our webinar this morning. We apologize to everybody for going over time, that not everybody could stay and remain for the webinar and the questions section of our webinar, but a deep gratitude to each and every panelist who have given absolutely valuable input on this issue. and eye-opening as well. And it seems like the Palestinian struggle it seems like there's so much that still needs to be done. And I hope that every single person who is able to can in some way, contribute to it in any way possible. And I thank you. And from the Essa Moosa Foundation, I also thank everybody for attending, and please keep a lookout for any of our other programs.